Thank you. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for coming to the Washington Student Achievement Council's 2026 legislative session recap. We are going to give a moment for folks to filter in from the waiting room, click on their Zoom link if they've RSVP'd, but we will get started in about 30 seconds just in recognition of the hour that we have to spend together today. Thanks so much for joining us. All right, great. Well, as folks continue to filter in here, again, we will get started with today's webinar. First, want to introduce myself. My name is Joel Anderson. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm Associate Director of Legislative and External Affairs at the Washington Student Achievement Council. We are so excited to have some incredible panelists with us today who will be introduced in a little bit and to share more with you all from the 2026 legislative session with respect to higher education. Next slide, please. Apologies for the echo. We will try to fix that as well. As we get going today, I wanted to share a little bit of information. Okay, great. We'll share a little information about how our webinar will be working today. First, this webinar is being recorded and will be distributed afterward. We also will not be using the raise hand option. So while we won't be taking live questions, we do encourage folks to share their questions in the chat for today's webinar. Sorry, in the Q&A feature. You can submit questions anonymously and also upvote questions if you are interested or share a question that someone else has submitted. And then lastly, the chat option today will be for introductions. So we have folks across the state and even across the country joining us today to hear more about the state legislative session. So please use the chat. Feel free to introduce yourself with your name and your organization. We had hundreds of folks sign up to join us today from federal congressional offices, from state legislative offices, nonprofits, philanthropic organizations, business organizations, and the like. So again, we are so excited to have you all here today, and we'll get started. Next slide, please. So again, we're very grateful to have three panelists joining us. I believe one of them maybe has jumped off and will be rejoining momentarily. But first, Simone Bowe, a lobbyist with the Washington Education Association. Thank you for being here. Bill Lyne, president from United Faculty of Washington, will be back on soon. And then Vanessa Ponce, executive director of the Washington Student Association. All three of them are here today to share their perspective, again, on the legislative session, the 2026 supplemental operating budget, and kind of other issues relevant to higher education. And so we can't wait to get into that discussion in just a little bit. Again, throughout the presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A feature. If you are not able to access Q&A because of sometimes there's been updates to Zoom or anything, please feel free to put questions in the chat and we will do our best to catch those as they come by. Next slide, please. So in terms of where we're heading today, we are going to start off with a little bit of background information about the Student Achievement Council and our work as a cabinet level state agency. We will then move into an overview of the 2026 legislative session and panel discussion. This will include a summary of enacted and failed legislation, the supplemental operating budget, and then other issues, again, relevant to the higher education space. And we'll be closing with a survey. And I do want to make a plug for this. Hopefully my link in my notes here today is correct, but this is now our second consecutive webinar where we are including a feedback form. We would love for folks to open this as our webinar is getting started today. And as we're presenting and having discussion, please feel free to keep that open and jot down your notes so that when we get to 1 p.m., this is just a quick submit and let us know how we're doing. We really appreciate your feedback, and actually that has significantly influenced the format of today's webinar. We're trying out some new approaches to organizing this information. So again, we hope that it is helpful and are looking forward to the discussion today. Next slide. So again, starting off with a little bit more information about the Student Achievement Council. We are a cabinet level state agency that looks at all levels of education from preschool through graduate school, but particularly transitional points. So likely when a student is going from high school to college and career, or potentially into a registered apprenticeship. We make recommendations to both the governor's office and the state legislature on policies and funding mechanisms that could improve educational attainment for all students across the state. And we also pursue this mission by administering things like state financial aid programs, i.e., the Washington College Grant and College Bound Scholarship, college savings plans like WA 529 Invest and Guaranteed Education Tuition, or GET, facilitating college access initiatives around things like FAFSA and WASFA completion, and of course, collaborating with external stakeholders like yourself to advocate the value of all post-secondary degrees and credentials after high school. Next slide. So it is in pursuit of this mission that WSAC strives to increase educational attainment for all people across the state, but particularly adults within the ages of 25 to 44. Our mission as a state is that 70% of this population will attain some sort of credential after high school across all racial and ethnic and geographic regions of the state and communities. Today, or as recently as 2023, we saw about 62% of Washington's adults in this age range had a credential after high school. In terms of reaching this goal, we have a strategic framework here at WSAC that centers a number of policy clusters: affordability, enrollment, completion, and student basic needs to bring us closer to this goal. And ultimately, our mission is that we believe that building an affordable and supportive educational environment will allow more Washington residents to enroll in and complete a credential-bearing program. Next slide. All right, last bit of housekeeping before we get into the 2026 legislative session. We wanted to make sure that we outlined for you all where we are in WSAC's annual cycle of stakeholder engagement and policy development. This is a responsibility that we take very seriously, and first want to emphasize that it's a year-round activity. It is not just in January when session starts, or March or April when session ends, but it's in June and August and October, and any time that a policy or budget idea comes to the front. I'm really grateful not only to our partners on the panel today, but also at the Student Achievement Council on our strategy and partnerships team for facilitating policy conversations throughout the year to ensure that our agency's budget and legislative requests actively reflect the needs of your communities. And moving this work forward, we will continue to be hosting pre and post session webinars. So you'll see on this schedule of when those are kind of scheduled throughout the year. We will also continue to be doing summer stakeholder engagement sessions to get feedback on what our policy and budget requests should look like. Some of you have attended those, and there's a spot in our feedback form to share if you've logged on in the past. But in addition to those events, we also hope to host, moving forward, a fourth quarterly event every fall, likely in October after budget and policy requests have been submitted. And we're considering a variety of options for what that event could look like. So if you're here today and you have ideas for things that you would love WSAC to present on, or other content that we could be covering, we would love to hear from you. And my contact information will be available toward the end of today's webinar. So again, thanks so much for your engagement. We really, really appreciate it. And with that, we'll transition to the next slide and get into the weeds of the 2026 legislative session. To start off, wanted to briefly remind folks about what WSAC submitted this year regarding budget and legislative requests. In total, we had 5 proposals that were submitted to the governor's office, and while the 2 proposals that were specific to the state budget were ultimately not funded, we did get approval for 3 legislative requests that all were filed as legislation during the 2026 session. These were informed by feedback, again, that we received during last year's summer stakeholder engagement sessions. And fortunately, one of these bills, Senate Bill 5963, did end up passing the legislature a little over a month ago now. What this bill will do is automatically qualify students eligible for the Passport to Careers program. These are students who are in foster care at age 13 or later, or experiencing unaccompanied homelessness in the year prior to enrolling in a post-secondary program for the maximum Washington College Grant. So starting next academic year, 26-27, every student in the state in foster care age 13 and older has now been guaranteed the Washington College Grant prior to filing for financial aid, either through the FAFSA or the WSFA. We are incredibly excited, I have to say, about this legislation and the promise that it brings to these students who recognize and represent some of Washington's most vulnerable youth, particularly those who are not always accessing post-secondary pathways. So again, this is just a little reminder of what WSAC submitted. And with that, we'll transition to our next slide and talk a little bit more about other legislation in the higher education space. While there were many bills this session related to higher education, only a handful of them ended up passing through the legislature. And I want to clarify that today's presentation includes quite a bit of detail. The goal here is not to cover every single bill or every single provision in our state's budget, but instead to provide a resource to you all and a record of what happened this session so that after the fact, you have links to bill numbers, to budget information, to other things that will be helpful as we look ahead to 2027. And also through this presentation, you will see bills and budget items categorized using WSAC's policy clusters mentioned before. So again, these are enrollment, affordability, completion, and student basic needs where appropriate. A couple of the other bills I wanted to highlight in today's discussion that did pass the legislature. Senate Bill 5841 in our enrollment cluster is going to require WSAC to share financial aid completion data with OSPI so that students can see on their high school and beyond plan as they're moving toward graduation whether or not they have filed a FAFSA or WSFA. This will be a real-time indicator that allows them, their peers, their teachers, counselors, et cetera, to be able to see whether or not they have filed and hopefully encourage them to get that application in if it's not yet done. We also unfortunately saw some cuts, which we'll get into a little bit later today. Senate Bill 6260 specifically cut funding for the Summer Running Start program, and for the next 2 years will limit the number of courses that students in that program are allowed to take. And then transitioning to the other side of our chart here in kind of an other category, there were a handful of bills that passed, but one of the things I wanted to highlight was House Bill 2492, which requires behavioral health education for apprentices in the building trades. While this is not all the legislation that passed, of course, we also have WSAC's bill around Passport to Careers and the Washington College Grant and a couple of other provisions. These were just a few things that we wanted to call out. But if we transition to our next slide, we'll see a much larger list of bills, unfortunately, that didn't make it this year. And I will share that we'll talk briefly here and then pause and transition to our panel discussion for a bit. So I would encourage you again to get those questions in, hopefully through the Q&A feature, but potentially in the chat as well. But again, thinking about legislation that did not pass this year, they were spread widely across WSAC's policy clusters. And I will leave it to my panelists to get a little bit more in the weeds, but I would say that I think this was a year that brought up a lot of aspirational policy, as well as some very concrete, practical proposals to improve the lives of students across the state. Just a few examples of this, Senate Bill 5978 on the left-hand side of your screen would have codified the Washington Guaranteed Admissions Program. We also saw House Bill 2098 in the affordability space, which would have increased access to the Washington College Grant, raised revenue paid into the Workforce Education Investment Account, or WEA, which will come up later, and temporarily lowered tuition for students. There were also a lot of measures in the affordability space overall. So this includes House Bill 2148 about providing a revolving student loan fund for graduate students. And then as we look towards student basic needs and other categories, we saw efforts through things like Senate Bill 6227 to collect data on parenting students and then protect the identities and data of students who have filed WSFA applications through House Bill 2132 on the right-hand side. Again, this is a lot more information that we'll be able to discuss in detail today, but we wanted to make sure that folks had a record of the bills that were around this session. And if we actually transition to our next slide and last slide for this section, you'll see that there were even more bills in the affordability space that didn't make it this year. Like most years, there was a lot of focus on the Washington College Grant and the College Bound Scholarship. But I specifically want to mention Senate Bill 5828 with respect to private not-for-profit four-year institutions, which are a close partner of the Student Achievement Council. Their state financial aid awards were cut significantly last year, in addition to other non-public institutions for both the Washington College Grant and the College Bound Scholarship. While Senate Bill 5828 did make it to the very last part of the legislative session, it ultimately was not voted on by the House and did not make it through the legislature. We also did not see Senate Bill 6276, again on the right-hand side in the other category, around the Workforce Education Investment Account move forward. We'll talk a little bit later today about what WIA is and how that account works, but essentially money from that account, a dedicated source of higher education revenue, was shifted to pay for existing higher ed expenses last year. And so there was an effort to kind of reverse that shift and protect revenue in that account for additional or supplemental higher education spending. Again, we'll talk about that in a little bit, but for now, just wanted to put that on folks' radar as well. So with that, I'm going to pause. And Grace, if you'd be willing to stop sharing our slides for a moment, we are going to introduce our panel for the first time. So again, thank you so much all for joining us. And Simone, maybe we could start with you as our Higher Education Coalition ringleader this year. Feel free to do quick introductions, but would also just love to get your initial take on any key legislation or bill-related items that you were working on this year.
Sure. Thanks, Joel. So just by way of quick introduction, I'm Simone Bowe. I'm one of the lobbyists with the Washington Education Association. I think many people identify us as a K-12 organization. We are a union representing K-12, and we represent faculty and staff at some of our community and technical colleges and faculty at our four-year regionals and the Evergreen State College. So we work in very close partnership with WSAC. Very grateful for Joel's, wrangling on the legislative side for the WSAC priorities. And this needs to have a lot of support, and I think my internet might be freezing, of course. Good. But we needed to really pull together as the higher education sector and have some shared priorities. And while, we're a union, we may have certain priorities. Vanessa represents students. They have certain priorities. There are certain things that we can all agree on in the higher education space. And so we looked to build coalition support around preserving and protecting higher education across the board. We wanted to make sure that there were no more cuts. We wanted to make sure that we didn't dip into WIA for anything that was not higher education related. And one thing that was important to us as a union that everyone in the higher education space agrees to is changing the fund split so that the state actually funds what they are encouraging the colleges to in terms of the cost of living adjustments. And so we worked to pull together students, labor, agency partners, administrators, and we met regularly. And that really helped us all stay on the same page and be able to figure out how we address the budget in particular, and then also certain policy bills. And on the flip side, the legislature themselves created their own caucus. So there is now a higher education caucus that exists with, I think, 10 to 14 legislators who prioritize higher education. And I know that we'll talk about that more, but it's a significant step for Washington State's legislature to have a body within it, in the House and the Senate, who understand and care about our students, our faculty, our systems, our institutions around higher education. And so we went into this session with the preserve and protect lens. We didn't put forth priority legislation. We wanted to make sure that if there was legislation that supported students, that supported their ability to succeed and persist in college, that we would support that. So the Passports to Career Bill 5963, we're supportive of those sorts of policy bills. So we're glad to see those move forward. 5841 was the high school and beyond plan for students to be able to see information around financial aid. We've partnered with WSAC on financial aid initiatives to make sure that while we have the best financial aid in the country that students actually apply for and get it. And so we saw 5841 as a way to be part of that, support for students. And we bridge K-12 and higher ed. So we worked to make sure that the policy worked at the K-12 side and also worked for ensuring that students could see the information and move on to higher education. We wanted to see 2617, the fund split bill, pass. I think we all sort of knew that that was a statement bill that wasn't going to pass this session just because of the budget situation. But it was really important that it had a hearing in both the House and its companion had a hearing in the Senate. And then I think we'll talk more, but 6260 was basically a budget bill and it had several cuts in addition to Running Start. We adamantly opposed it. It cuts Running Start. And I feel like we have to say, but not as bad as it could have been. And so we know we're facing a cut. We know it impacts students, but we live to see another day with helping students have access to, in particular, summer Running Start. And so I want to pause and turn it over to my other panelists. I think we'll have time for other conversations, but this is a wonderful opportunity. We're glad to be partnering with WSAC and people like Vanessa and Bill. So I think I'll turn it over to Vanessa next, if that works for you, Vanessa.
Works for me. Thank you, Simone. Hi, everybody. My name is Vanessa Ponce. I'm the executive director of the Washington Student Association. We represent students from almost all of the major public four-year institutions, some of our community and technical colleges, as well as all of the regional institutions. Representing over 150,000 students across the state, including graduate students as well. With that being said, we partnered a lot with WSAC this year on some of their priority bills. And so I'm not going to touch too much on those because Joel already talked about them. But some of the bills that we were really sad to see go this session were undocumented student supports like Senator Hansen's SAFE Act, 5906, and Representative Levitt's parenting, or not parenting student, data, WAFSA data bill. Both of those would have protected, one of those would have protected the data of students applying to the WAFSA, and then Senator Hansen's SAFE Act would have protected students going to classes and not allowing immigration enforcement officers into non-public spaces of institutions. We were also sad about the WIA supplanting language. We got that bill up and running this session, and we're really hoping that it were to have moved forward, and it did not. And then just overall grad student supports. Our grad students lost a lot of aid in the previous year, and so we were hoping to see some additional grad student supports, which did not come to fruition, but one of those being the Working Childcare Connections program. Right now, grad students are not allowed to utilize that program, and so we were hoping to see an expansion to allow them to apply. And then our last biggest priority that we were sad to see go was the Collecting Parenting Student Data bill. One of the biggest challenges that we've been facing as advocates is that as we're looking for bills to support parenting students, the challenge we continuously run into is the fact that we don't know how many parenting students we have in the state of Washington. And so we're really hoping to see some form of collecting data on parenting students in order to be able to advocate for them moving forward.
Thanks, Vanessa. Bill?
Great. Yeah, thank you. My name is Bill Lyne. I'm the president of the United Faculty of Washington State. We represent the faculty at Eastern, Western, Central, and the Evergreen State College. And first, just a huge thanks to Joel and WSAC for organizing this and having us here, especially to Joel, who was heroic during this legislative session, both for WSAC and in his mentorship of the WIA Oversight Board. From our perspective, we were disappointed to see the digital transcripts bill die. We were disappointed to see the guaranteed admissions bill die. Both of those things would have helped get more kids into college, would have helped increase college enrollments. I think it's important to remember in this that we were still reeling from the cuts that came in the biennial budget last year. And so some of the things that were introduced this year we're trying to restore some of that. So there was the big bill from Representative Reed about the Washington College grant that would have increased the taxes and also increased the eligibility for the Washington College grant was partially in response to the Washington the top level of the MFI eligibility for the Washington College grant being cut in the biennial budget the year before. So it would have been nice to see some of that. It was very disappointing to see the bill to restore some of the college grant stuff for the independent colleges of Washington not pass. That would have made that would have restored some of those students' financial aids that got taken away again last year. Um, it was also disappointing to see the summer running start get cut a little bit too. Again, as Simone said, it was not as bad as it could have been, but still, it was a cut, and it's going to make a real difference in students' lives. Overall speaking, higher ed didn't get punished this year the way that we did last year, but there were still things around the edges that are going to make it harder for students to go to college, make it harder for students to get into college. And those are bad things, and we should try to undo them in the future.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Bill. I know that we'll transition in a second to discussion a little bit about the state budget, but we did have one question come in about any plans for future legislation to combat the harm we're seeing at the federal level to higher education. I will say briefly, one of the bills that we spotlighted a second ago about providing student loan assistance for graduate students. I know that that bill actually was introduced specifically in response to the elimination of Grad Plus loans. And I think that there are some other efforts and interest at the state level about thinking, how do we, preserve higher education here in Washington state and ensure that students continue to have a reasonable, affordable, sustainable pathway toward a degree or credential. But that's just one thing that I noticed on my end. Do anyone here on our panel today have other thoughts on responding to federal actions before we transition into our next section?
And speak to, not specific to higher ed yet, but in the K-12 space, we saw some state level policy codified so that things that happen at the federal level keep us a little bit immune to what they're trying to do. So basically trying to codify into our state law some federal policy that we like and appreciate. I know that our state, like graduate students, are looking at some legislation that California has passed around investing in research and preserving and protecting research funding, which has been very vulnerable under this administration. I don't want to speak for them, and I don't have enough information to, but I think everyone's aware that we face threats, and I think people are trying to find creative, proactive, actual solutions to those threats. But that's all the information I have right now, and I think we're all trying to do our best to keep our students and our institutions whole.
Thanks, Simone.
I think the best response to federal cuts is more state funding, and we just got to keep looking for that.
Great. Thanks, Bill. Vanessa?
Yeah, absolutely agree. One of the other things that we're monitoring right now is how the federal cuts to SNAP benefits and other um, resources for students may be impacting students' ability to remain in higher education. And so we're monitoring that at this moment to see if we think a state policy would be helpful moving forward.
Awesome. Thanks, Vanessa. And thanks all for the discussion. Again, please continue to use the Q&A feature or the chat feature if Q&A is not working. But with that, my colleague Grace Nelson, if you'd be able to share our slides again and transition to our next slide, we will start talking a little bit more about the 2026 supplemental operating budget. I also recognized I did not initially introduce my colleague, Grace. She's our executive assistant at WSAC and an incredible resource. So please make sure to give her a round of applause from wherever you're watching today for her support in today's webinar. So we will start off talking about the budget with respect to cuts before we get a little bit into new investments. As Bill mentioned a few minutes ago, I think that this was a year for higher education to breathe a bit of a sigh of relief, but also kind of brace for the future. We'll talk a little bit in a few slides about why that's the case more in depth. But to start off with more specific information about cuts experienced in the sector, in the enrollment space, we did see again cuts to the summer running start program. Specifically, what that means is that over the next 2 years, 26-27 and 2027-28, students taking summer running start courses will only be allowed to enroll in one class as opposed to two classes, again, for the next 2 summers. And then that 2-class limit should be restored in the following year. However, that is contingent on the millionaire's tax, Senate Bill 6346, going into effect and having revenue be collected. So we will kind of wait and see how that policy moves forward and is potentially challenged in the courts. In the affordability space, we did see some additional cuts to a program that is now not operational, but the Washington Student Loan Program. WSAC had previously had a number of appropriations for this program. However, money was shifted back to our state's general fund prior to the program launching. And so the remaining funding for that, about $1.7 million, was shifted to the state's general fund. That program no longer has any funding remaining. And then moving into kind of our other or general category, we did see some more specific cuts at individual institutions. At our community college system, we saw centers of excellence defunded to the tune of almost $2.5 million. We also saw almost $2 million cut from Washington State University's Institute for Northwest Energy Futures, and then another $250K or $260K or so cut from the Thriving Communities Initiative at UW. I think the bulk of our conversation, though, will center on what were administrative reductions to the higher education sector and other higher education agencies. You can see that these ranged in amount, but at our largest partner, the State Board for Community and Technical Colleges, they'll be seeing a cut of about $2.2 million, then $1.25 million at University of Washington, $750,000 at Washington State, and $175,000 at our regional institutions around the state as well. In addition to institutions specifically, the Student Achievement Council saw a cut as well of a little over $500,000. And then our partners at the Workforce Board and Employment Security Department also saw some small administrative reductions as well. We'll go to the next slide, please. So while there were cuts, there were also some new appropriations in higher education, and I think it's worth mentioning those as well. Some of these, however, were things that were legally mandated, so not necessarily new discretionary spending, though we do appreciate, of course, the state's commitment to programs that we have to keep pace with. Part of that is over $6 million to continue reimbursing college and the high school fees, ensuring that students can take college and the high school courses to earn dual credit and not have any costs to them. These were appropriations to a number of our institutions across the state. We also saw full funding for caseload forecasts for the Washington College Grant, about $140 million, and the College Bound Scholarship, an additional $6 million. And both of these appropriations are in response to projections, of increased enrollment for both of those programs. So again, as folks have shared earlier, we are excited to see that more folks are continuing to use our state financial aid programs and continuing to make those successful. And then in the other category, we saw a variety of investments. This included $15 million to the University of Washington for their Behavioral Health and Learning Center. We saw some collective bargaining agreements funded at institutions that were not funded in last year's biennial operating budget. So this was largely at our community college system, but also for Central, Eastern, and Western Washington universities. We saw additional funding provided to continue maintaining tuition levels and preventing any sort of tuition increases through the College Affordability Program. And then lastly, in addition to some smaller provisos noted below, we did see the restoration of some operating costs that were cut last year at the Evergreen State College. So to the tune of about $2.7 million, we were glad to see those appropriations as well. If we could go to the next slide, please. We have 2 more pieces of information we wanted to share about other provisions in the state budget that either carry an appropriation or do not carry an appropriation, but still require agencies to take some sort of action. Then we'll transition again back to our panel discussion to kind of get into the weeds of the budget. But there were 2 other provisos of note that carried some funds. The first is that our state's Employment Security Department is being asked to conduct a higher education and workforce development landscape analysis. This will provide more information on where the gaps are and where the opportunities are for our state to produce more high demand credentials and other opportunities in spaces where we need additional students and, of course, additional folks to enter our workforce. Though there is not a due date for when that analysis will be completed. And then there was over $100,000, almost $140,000 provided to the Evergreen State College and specifically the State Institute for Public Policy, or WSIP, to study programs that have improved post-secondary enrollment over the last 15 years. That study will be available, it looks like, in about a year and a half or so. So toward the end of next year, we will look forward to seeing the results of that research as well. And if we transition to our last slide about the supplemental operating budget, we'll see again a lot of information. I apologize, but just wanted to have this available for folks' reference. There were a number of provisions in our state budget that did not carry a fiscal impact, but certainly carry impacts and implications for higher education moving forward. The biggest among those is at the top, which is to say that in order to prevent additional cuts to higher education this year, the legislature chose to shift collectively about $240 million from our institutions of higher education capital project accounts. These are where building fees that students pay for capital projects are stored. Those funds were shifted to cover otherwise general fund expenditures at institutions. And then the money was essentially backfilled with new general obligation bonds on behalf of the state. This was a one-time maneuver in fiscal year 27, and again, was intended to help us prevent cuts to higher education this year. However, since these funds were not new appropriations, they were just funds that existed at institutions and were essentially re-budgeted, the overall outlook of how higher education is funded in our state didn't shift a ton, and we'll talk a little bit later about what that looks like today. But that was kind of really the big maneuver that was made this session in the higher education space. We also saw a key priority for our partner Simone at the Washington Education Association included in the budget, which was reinstating language about a couple of ongoing or existing appropriations for key investments at our community college system. This included over $40 million for nurse educator salaries, high demand program faculty salaries, and then guided pathways, a system-wide investment to support students in the community college system. I do want to clarify again, these investments are existing. This is not new money, but it was just an effort to define those in the budget and ensure that this money is going toward those intended purposes as they were first appropriated a number of years ago. In addition to that, we saw a few other requirements. The community college system will be telling the legislature more about opportunities to reduce redundancy or excess costs in their system by the end of this year, December 1st, 2026. You will also see actually me specifically working with a group called the WIA Oversight Board here at WSAC with high-tech trade associations to see how we can better expand high-demand programs here in the state of Washington. And then lastly, WSAC also received permission to provide funding a bit more flexibly through a program called the Supporting Students Experiencing Homelessness Program, which provides emergency funding to students facing housing insecurity. So again, these are broad brushstrokes about our state's budget. I think that is our last budget slide. So Grace, if you'd be willing to bring our slides down one more time, we'd love to pause again and turn it back to our panel to get a little bit more into the budget as opposed to legislation. Maybe we could mix it up this time. And Bill, if you'd be willing to kick us off, just we'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of the approach that the legislature took to funding higher education this year and what you're thinking about either this year or looking toward the future.
Sure. I think it's important to remember that after the real bloodletting that we had last year, that this year we came in and the state budget outlook was still bad and we were still worried about it. And a lot of the initial proposals from say the governor's budget or some of the early things that we were hearing from the House and the Senate made it sound like this was going to be a very bad year. It turned out to be not nearly as bad as that, but I want to caution us not to sort of start suffering from Stockholm syndrome. There were still cuts. That first slide that Joel had up there were $17 million in cuts. That's not nothing. It's a lot better than we thought it was going to be. but at the same time, we are already 10 steps back from the biennial budget the year before. And to just be held to a place where we're keeping our nose above water feels like victory, but it's really not. I mean, and it was politically a bit of a victory, but in terms of actual resources going for our students, it was another much smaller than we expected, but a step backward all the same. The way that they managed to keep us basically with our nose above water was the fund swap thing that Joel was talking about, where $240 million was moved out of the general fund appropriations to state institutions and spent on something else. That money was backfilled with money that we're basically stealing from our students who pay fees to do various kinds of capital improvements. That money got shifted into our operating budgets on a one-time situation, and that then got replaced with more debt for the state. This was a good thing for us, but not necessarily the best way for things to go going forward. It's a very precarious house of cards that has been set up with this supplemental budget. And I think it's going to be really important politically for us to continue to keep the pressure on going into the next big biennial session next year. I mean, the move from the $240 million that was moved out of state institutions' operating budgets and in back into the general fund is less general fund money for higher education. That is supposed to be a one-time thing. We're going to have to be very careful and very persistent in making sure that the legislature lives up to that promise to make it a one-time thing, and that $240 million doesn't just disappear forever next year. So on that cheery note, I'll turn it over to Simone or Vanessa.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Bill. I think we share a lot of very similar concerns to you, right? It felt like this year was a win, and in some respects it was, but we're not blind to the fact that our institutions are still losing funding at the end of the day, and we have some concerns about how we're going to rebuild the funding in those accounts that the money was taken out of, and with this being a one-time ask, how we're going to continue to fund higher education moving forward in the future, right? $240 million is a lot of money, and so that was a huge concern of ours, is those two components of how can we rebuild that funding into those accounts, and how are we going to continue to fund higher education with a deficit, because we don't want next year to be even worse than it could have been this session with the decisions that were being made. And I completely agree that we need to continue to put pressure on the legislature to fund higher education and to find a better system in which we're adequately funding higher education through the general fund, not taking money from all these other accounts every year.
I think I echo everything that Bill and Vanessa have said, and the new pieces I would add or restate are higher education is not protected. So we go in every year having to fight to maintain anything that we have, knowing that we've already lost $400 million and then potentially this $240 million, depending on what happens, next year. Next year is a budget writing session. And so our lens will be, again, preserve and protect, but also what are we doing in terms of individual organizations like WEA, coalitions, other groups, to have the legislators individually understand how important higher education is in their own districts. Every legislator is touched by a community and technical college. Many are proud of their regional four-year private independent colleges. Everyone has some experience with it, and I think part of our work as, such a variety of people on this call who care about student outcomes and success, how do we highlight the good work that we're doing and the need for continued investment in times that are probably going to be more and more difficult, and we don't have the same protection as something like basic education in the K-12 space. I think the other piece that's so critical, and I think I've seen our community really align behind, we need not only the funding for the institutions to pay for the programs and the faculty and the staff and the buildings and everything, but we also need to prioritize those wraparound services that support our students who are coming in. And I think we've done a good job identifying what those needs are and making sure that we're being responsive to them as a state. And that takes everyone coming in. And I think the more that people can tell the story, it sounds trite, but it's very true. Legislators really do care about what's happening in their districts. And so the more we can show them what's happening, invite them in, introduce them to students, have them understand a parenting student and what that looks like, or the support that goes to a student experiencing homelessness or food insecurity. It's just, it all creates the fabric of this higher education system in Washington State.
Absolutely. Thank you all for sharing. I will also note that I had an unstable connection as well a second ago. So if I freeze, panelists, please feel free to pick up in my stead. But I think you all make some great points. Bill, you mentioned that any cut is a bad cut, right? I mean, higher education is cut year after year after year and is not a sector protected in our state constitution. And so we have to make the case, as Simone shared and Vanessa shared, that higher education deserves funding like every other sector. And I think it's also really helpful to clarify for today's legislators what today's students look like, right? Not every student is coming straight from high school and is 18, right? We have many students who are parents, veterans, trying to navigate significant geographic distances to their campuses, or trying to access classes with disabilities or other challenges they're facing in order to make ends meet. And specifically, Simone, to your last point about basic needs, we know today that about 2/3 of all the true cost of college is outside the classroom, right? It's housing, it's food, childcare, shelter, et cetera. And so, it's so important, again, to just keep telling that story. And I'm grateful to you all on this panel for, of course, helping us push that narrative forward. I did want to note, we had one question in the Q&A about essentially like, could we help relieve, budgetary constraints with better monitoring how folks are using state financial aid, and if they're withdrawing or not completing courses, is money going back to the state? I will say this looks like this question is anonymous. I've copied it on my end to do some follow-up individually here at WSAC, but I do know we have some policies in place so that if students do not finish or have not maintained satisfactory academic progress, for instance, there is we do have policies in place for repayment of awards. But again, I will dig into some more detail, and if this questioner would be able to maybe follow up with me via email, I'd be happy to find out a little bit more about that. So maybe before we transition briefly to our last section, anybody have any final words or other thoughts on like where do we go from here in terms of like higher education budgeting? Like, is there a light at the end of the tunnel? Is there hope or other strategies that we as a sector could be using to ensure that higher education is protected?
I'll take a stab at that. I mean, and I think this is going to show up on a slide later, but one of the good things that happened this year was the creation of a higher ed caucus within the legislature. It's great. They have their own letterhead and a logo even now, so they're an official caucus. We helped bring that together with a coalition of business and labor who went around meeting with legislators during the interim and trying to get them to understand themselves as a group of folks who were genuinely interested in higher ed. The keeping that momentum up is going to depend a lot on things beyond those of us who are constantly doing this, things beyond people like Simi or Simone or Vanessa. We need to get voting citizens of Washington interested in higher ed. So everybody who's on this webinar today, go tell all your friends, go tell all your family to write the legislature and tell them that higher ed matters as a voting issue, especially since we're going into an election year. I think it's important to remember that what we have ultimately is not a fiscal problem, it's a political problem. Last year in the biennial budget, the Legislature raised $9 billion in new taxes and cut higher ed by $500 million. Those are choices that legislators are making based on what they're hearing from their constituents and from people who give them money. So the problem that we have to stop the continual cutting of higher ed that Joel was talking about is a political one, and it's one that's going to take the organizing of people beyond just those of us who are constantly engaged with this, and getting to people who vote for legislators, who donate to legislators, and making them understand that they care about higher ed.
Thanks, Bill.
So I think my hope lies in real people on our campuses who interact with students, talking to legislators and showing them the really good work. And Vanessa's student group, student members, individuals are on campus every day highlighting stories and situations, and it's just amazing. So we're really fortunate to have such an active student group. And so my hope lies with real people telling real stories to our legislators and hoping to build that higher education legislative caucus of people who care about it and will come up with solutions, with help to preserve and protect and hopefully reinvest.
Absolutely. And I want to echo what both Bill and Simone shared. At the end of the day, for us, it's a matter of making sure that people understand that higher education is more than the students, it's more than the staff, and it's more than the faculty, right? Our students have parents, and our parents vote, right? And so, those kinds of things are really important to share with the legislature is the scope in which the amount of people that higher education impacts are here and they care about higher education. And we need to share those stories with legislators. As Simone shared, I have students who are with me every single day at the legislature on campus, about 10 to 11 of them. And each one of them hosted a lobby day that brought so many students from around the state to the legislature to talk directly with them about their own experiences as students. And as moving as those student experiences can be, ultimately what matters is the politics behind the system of who got them elected and who they will hear from the most. And so it really encouraging people to talk to their elected officials about how higher education is important and deserves investment moving forward.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Vanessa. Thanks all for your thoughts on that. Grace, I think if we could share slides again, we're moving into our last 8 or 9 minutes or so of today's webinar. And so I want to cover two other higher education topics of note before closing with a little bit more discussion and some final words before we go. As Bill shared earlier, we did want to provide some background on what higher education funding looks like here in the state of Washington. To be clear, this slide in front of you shows a summary of appropriations to higher education, not necessarily total budgeted funds, so other federal or local sources of funding or funding that comes from institutions themselves. That is not necessarily in this picture, but this represents funding that the legislature directly provides to the higher education sector. We previously provided a summary both in January and beforehand that showed about 3/4 of our state's higher education funding has historically come from the state's general fund. And when we wrote our 25-27 operating budget last year, we saw a significant decline in that percentage to about 2/3 or 66%, which you'll see in the middle column of this graph. That was due to a shift of $400 million from our state's workforce education investment account. This was a dedicated source of revenue that previously had been legally prohibited from replacing or supplanting other higher education funding. But last year, that prohibition was removed from statute for this biennium and likely for the next biennium, 27-29. And so the legislature was allowed to shift funds a little bit more all over the place. And one of the big goals this year for higher education advocates was preventing that shifting or supplanting from getting worse. I'm very happy to say that that did, in fact, that came to fruition, right? There was no additional shifting of funds from WIA. However, if you look at the graphic again that we have in front of us, on the left-hand side, you'll see final numbers for how higher education was funded in the 23-25 or previous biennium. what was funded during last year's 25-27 operating budget. And on the right-hand side, a summary of where we stand today now that the 2026 supplemental budget has been enacted. You'll see here that despite the fund shifts with capital fees and other funds in the higher education space, the picture didn't change a lot, but that the share of funding from our state's general fund actually continued to go down for higher education. And the Workforce and Education Investment Account, or WEA, did take on an additional share of that. And so, as Bill shared and as others shared, I think that everyone in the higher education space is really gearing up for the future to say, what do we care about? What do we prioritize? And ensuring that sources of revenue, dedicated to higher education like WEA are protected moving forward. If we go to the next slide, please. The last topic we wanted to mention today before our last kind of closing comments were that, again, the legislature did create a legislative caucus this year for higher education. I want to share my deep gratitude and sincere thanks from all of us here to Representative Dave Paul and Senator Tawana Nobles, our higher education committee chairs this session, for spearheading the development of this caucus, which had more than 10, it sounds like maybe even as many as 15 legislators sign up this year to prioritize a few different things, but particularly protecting and restoring financial aid, preventing, further restrictions to higher education programs, and then preserving dedicated funding in WEA. Again, as I mentioned earlier, for higher education and workforce development purposes. They also convened or facilitated a sign-on letter to budget writers this year in support of higher education, and they secured 40 legislators to sign that. It was an incredibly bipartisan letter, restating the caucus's goals. And I think not only our panelists here, but many other higher education advocates were incredibly excited to see that letter move forward. So that was, again, just a quick review of some other topics here. And Grace, if we could take our slide down, that would be great. But in our closing minutes here, would love to turn back to our panel for just kind of any final thoughts, either about these other developments in higher education that maybe don't show up on paper, but certainly show up in practice and in relationship with legislators and advocates. And I know we've been mixing it up, but Vanessa, maybe we could start with you on what you see in terms of kind of future partnership building in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what I really love about working in higher education and what I've loved about this session is this was my first session doing higher education work, and having people around us that knew what was going on were really helpful and crucial. Joel, you were absolutely incredible in answering every single one of our questions. Probably daily, you were being bothered by me or one of my students about something that we needed. And so one of the things that I've loved about working in the space is having so many people around us to build relationships with. And one of the things that I found very valuable was knowing that in all of our meetings with legislators, we weren't the only ones advocating on this behalf. We were very fortunate to have a weekly standing meeting with the chair of the Higher Education Committee in the House, Representative Paul, policy people in the Senate for higher education, and those relationships between knowing that so many of us are advocating and talking on the same things is really important. And what I would love to see moving forward is those continual conversations happening amongst a coalition of partners in higher education, as well as this new higher education caucus developing itself into something that people know about, people understand what's going on, and that we're setting up these legislators to succeed in their goal of protecting and preserving higher education through continual conversation with all of us. And so those are the things that I would really love to see moving forward in the higher ed space.
Thanks, Vanessa. Maybe Bill and then Simone to round us out.
Sure. I mean, what I would say is just very short. I agree with everything that Vanessa said and everything that Simone has said already. I think that the thing that we want, we have some momentum. The Higher Ed Caucus is an excellent development. The elections that are coming up are going to rearrange some of that. There's going to be lots of new legislators who are going to have their own ideas. I think it's incumbent upon all of us across the state to get out, get involved in the electoral process, go to the town halls, continue to remind legislators that rank and file people who vote for them care about higher education. If that will be the thing that we can do most that we need most to do, I think, to build on the momentum that we developed in this session.
I agree. It's like a yes and. I am so proud that our state passed House Bill 2158, which created one of the best, most robust financial aid um, things for students in our state. And I think we have that kind of promise to live up to. And it means that we need to make sure financial aid stays accessible, that we have the supports to support students on whatever path they're on to, completion. For us, we represent the workers in the system, and I think they are also a really big part, have heart and soul invested in our systems, and um, care a lot and want to be included in all of, in everything as well. So I think our legislators have their work cut out for them in terms of continuing to advocate just with incredible strength to support higher education. I think we're there for them and we'll continue to just highlight and work together. But I'm proud of our state, proud of the work that we do. And obviously there are so many people on this call, just looking at the intros in the chat, who love and care and work in this space in really different capacities, but we're all necessary for it. So just grateful to be part of the fabric that of everything that we've pulled together for higher ed in our state. So thanks, Joel.
Yeah, thanks, Simone. I realize we're just a minute over today, so thank you, number one, to my panelists, Vanessa, Simone, Bill, for your partnership and also for being cool with me running a tight ship today in our lunch hour. But to all of our other attendees, thank you so much for coming. I'll be following up on some of the individual questions we didn't quite get to during today's webinar, and especially on how to keep in touch with the Higher Education Legislative Caucus. If you have any questions, please feel free to fill out our feedback form. I've plugged that in the chat a couple of times if you saw. There is also a chance to share feedback, comments, concerns, etc. there as well. So we will hold this webinar open for just a minute or two for folks to check the chat or save any other final details. But otherwise, thank you so much for coming and joining us today. We will see you all soon for our next webinar in a few months. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Joel. See you soon.